You could say that Massachusetts was settled by people who couldn't get along in England, that Rhode Island and Connecticut were settled by people who couldn't get along in Massachusetts, and that Vermont was settled by people who couldn't get along in Connecticut and now have a lot of trouble getting along with each other. You could say all this, but not without fear of contradiction. You can't say much of anything in Vermont without being contradicted. Vermont was born in Dissent. When the settlers finally agreed to form a sort of republic that might or might not become a state, they gave it a name already in use, so they had to change it. Then they found out they didn't have one state, they had two, East Vermont and West Vermont. Separated by the spine of the Green Mountains, the population of the two halves differed in background, temperament, and religious and political views, so that wherever you lived, you were always at odds with the people on the other side of the hill. Vermonters are a clan of survivors, bound by a heritage of 200 years of bitter winters and short growing seasons. Being born in Dissent, Vermonters practice it not as a right, but as a duty. They have raised Dissent to a folk art. No matter what proposal is made, the first response must be in the negative. Negotiations can begin only after all the flavor has been chewed out of the argument. Take the landscape you've been looking at. Beautiful view, isn't it? But if you made that comment to a Vermonter, he might say,
maybe so, but if you had to plow that view and harrow it and cultivate it and hoe it and mow it and fence it and pay taxes on it, it'd look pretty darn ornery.
Vermont is a small state as states go, but it's been said that if you got an iron and pressed it out flat, it would be as big as Texas. One visitor who had spent his vacation driving all over the state made his last stop at a farmer's roadside apple stand. The traveler said,
"Nice little state you have here. Lived here all your life?"
Not yet.
Keith Jennison, author of the book Vermont is Where You Find It, is a sixth-generation Vermonter. He spent the best part of his youth on the family homestead in Swanton. An early commitment to reading and writing led him to jobs on the St. Albans Messenger and the Burlington Free Press, and eventually to an award-winning career in New York book publishing. During his publishing years, he counted among his friends and companions Robert Frost, Carl Sandburg, John Steinbeck, Saul Bellow, Malcolm Cowley, Ernest Hemingway, and Jack Kerouac. In World War II, he served with the 10th Infantry Regiment as a combat correspondent on leave from the Office of War Information. After the war, he resumed his publishing activities, spending 10 years as senior editor at the Viking Press before resigning to join the faculty of New York University. He's written more than a dozen works of fiction and nonfiction, as well as a group of picture and text books that have made the wit and wisdom of the Northeast known throughout the country. The first of these unique volumes was published in 1941 and has sold almost 500,000 copies.
I don't know where all the Vermont stories came from, and I don't know how so many of them came to me. I guess I heard the first one from my grandfather, who was talking about his father in the Civil War. He told me that after the war, the Grand Army of the Republic held annual conventions. One year, the convention was held in Columbus, Ohio, and in one of the social gatherings, the Ohio delegation began to tease the Vermonters about their state and its products. One Ohioan said that all we raised up here was big piles of manure. My grandfather said he could still hear the words his father had used in telling the man off.
Before you was even a state, we had taken out the first patent ever put on anything. We designed the plow that broke your plains and built the first electric motor. We had teachers' colleges for men and women and sent you the best teachers you ever had. Yep, we fertilized your whole damn West.
Of course, for many years, there were more cows than people in Vermont. This fact was the subject of a classic Vermont dialogue.
Is it true there are more cows than people in Vermont?
Yep.
How'd that come about?
We prefer them.
That was a long time ago. These days, we welcome people who come here to visit and the ones who come here to stay. Not too long ago, one old Vermonter had this to say about the new settlers.
In the old days, we used to eat in the house and go to the bathroom in the yard. These new folks do it just the opposite.
For some Vermonters, it's hard to get the hang of the new folks.
That artist fellow from New York says he bought the Phelps place for the view, but all you can see is Granger's silo and a bunch of mountains.
It's not the new people, though, just the idea of change. One of the first interviews I did after I went to work for the St. Albans Messenger was with a Franklin County representative we'd been sending to the state legislature for almost 20 years. I said, "You must have seen a lot of changes during your years in Montpelier."
Sure have, and I've been against all of them.
Now, even the country stores have changed. In the early days of radio advertising, one customer asked for a certain kind of cold cereal that had been getting a big hard sell on the airwaves.
We don't carry it anymore. It sells too fast.
As a part-time farm kid, I saw enough of Vermont farmers to realize that they had a contract with the land and the weather. All you can do is put up with the thin-soiled rock pastures that grow more daisies and Indian paintbrush than grass for grazing, the hay in the cornfields that almost never get the right sequence of rain and sun, and the cows who would, if you gave them a chance, eat enough skunk cabbage to ruin a day's milk from the whole herd. There was nothing you could do about it. You put up with what you got.
Used to be anybody could farm. All you needed was a strong back. Nowadays, you get so much advice, you need a college education to figure out what will do you the least harm.
Back in the days when I was a farm kid, Hermie Boudreau, our best milker, told me where all the rabbits came from before my parents got around to it. One day, he told me about what happened when Wesley Decker, our neighbor, let his 8-year-old son help him with a difficult calving. When it was all over, the little boy asked,
"How'd that calf get in there in the first place?"
Just before I went away to school, I said goodbye to Hermie, and he said he had some advice for me. I asked him what it was.
Never walk barefoot and blindfold across a barnyard.
If you are a Vermonter, you have weather on your mind almost all the time, except when you're asleep and not dreaming about it. There is a whole category of Vermont weather truisms.
Do you think it's going to rain?
Be a long dry spell if it don't.
Do you think it's going to stop raining?
It always has.
Do you think we're going to have some nice weather for a change?
Lady, the only people who predict weather around here are fools and strangers.
Part of the Castleton weather folklore has it that one morning an overnight guest at a home on the north side of Main Street got up the morning after a 10-hour blizzard and started up to the general store. But the store was on the south side of the street, and there was a 5-foot snowdrift barring his way. Across the street, he saw a man shoveling snow off the roof of his house. He called over,
How'd you get across the street?
Born here.
The classic weather comment may have been made by the Pulteney farmer, who, as a result of a new land survey, was told that he didn't live in Vermont after all. His farm was in New York.
Well, thank the good God Almighty, I couldn't have stood another of them Vermont winters.
There is an unwritten law in Vermont that when you meet somebody you know on any given day, your first remark must be about the weather. It is expected of you, and it puts people off balance if you don't. If you do this duty by your neighbor, you don't have to say anything to him for the rest of the day. Your social responsibilities have been discharged. Castleton, the town I live in, has a broad main street. There used to be a trolley on it you could take into Rutland. The street is so wide you can stop in the middle for a conversation without interfering with the traffic. One morning when I was crossing from the general store to the post office, I met Jimmy O'Neill, the retired postmaster. This was the first time I had seen Jimmy that day, so I prepared my obligatory greeting. We were in the middle of the most beautiful succession of August days I had ever seen. I greeted Jimmy carefully by saying, "Kind of a nice day." After the required pause, Jimmy said,
Yes, it is. For a town this size.
Vermonters are supposed to be stingy with money and stingy with words. Vermonters are not stingy. They're just broke most of the time. As far as words go, Vermonters mostly don't like to talk to anybody they haven't talked to before. This makes starting a conversation hard. Most of the time, they give the impression that there's a local custom of not saying anything unless it improves on silence. Calvin Coolidge is perhaps the best-known native son of Vermont. He didn't adopt the role of the taciturn Vermonter who spent words as reluctantly as money. He was the role. Oral history has preserved this Sunday morning exchange between Mr. and Mrs. Coolidge.
How did you like the new minister's sermon, Calvin?
He didn't do the text any harm.
What was the subject of the sermon?
Sin.
And what was his conclusion?
He was again it.
After Calvin's speech at the Republican National Convention in support of Herbert Hoover for the job Calvin did not choose to run for, on the way out a woman stopped him and told him how thrilling and inspiring it had been.
I stood up all the way through it.
So did I.
Given the right circumstances, most Vermonters are ready to talk up a blizzard of words on some subjects. Farming, fishing, hunting, politics, taxes, trucks, and the infamy of the federal government, but not very much about marriage and sex. One young Vermont woman, a distant cousin of a famous Boston family, was invited to a large family reunion. At one point in the festivities, the grand old lady of the dynasty observed,
In Boston, breeding is everything.
Well, we enjoy it up in Vermont, too. But we try to have some other interests.
Some Vermont folklore sayings.
I've got a good man for a husband. The only mean thing he ever said to me was that he sure would hate to reap like I sow.
Sometimes when I think of everything you've meant to me for all these years, it's almost more than I can stand not to tell you so.
Independent voters often swing most Vermont elections, from minor local offices to the highest state offices.
Who am I going to vote for? I ain't made up my mind yet, but when I do, I'm going to be damn bitter about it.
Why am I going to vote for Ben Johnson? Well, he's the only one of the candidates I ain't met.
After listening to the keynote speaker at a political rally for 15 minutes, a slightly deaf Vermonter turned to a man sitting next to him and said,
What's he talking about?
He don't say.
To seek directions on how to get to some destination is surely as ancient as travel itself. The cliche, "you can't get there from here," is usually attributed to a Vermonter. Not so. The Vermont version is,
Can you tell me how to get to the Plattsburgh Ferry?
If I was going to the Plattsburgh Ferry, I wouldn't start from here.
there are loads of Vermont epigrams about roads and how to get places. The dialogues are usually between a visitor who is in a car and a Vermonter who isn't.
Where's this road go?
Don't go nowhere. Stays right here.
How far is it to Fairfax?
Don't know.
Does this road go to Fairfax?
I don't know.
Say, you don't know much, do you?
Nope. But I ain't lost.
Does it make any difference which road I take to Boston?
Not to me, it don't.
Is this the road to Montpelier?
Nope. But it'll get you there.
How far is it to Burlington?
Well, it seems farther than it is, but you'll find out that it ain't.
A Texas cattleman driving a big Cadillac found himself stopped as a farmer followed his cows across the road from the pasture to the barnyard.
Let me ask you something. How big a spread you got here?
Well, you see that line of larch trees up there on that ridge? It runs from there down to that stream and over by that hedgerow.
Back in Texas, I got a ranch that I can get in my truck after breakfast and drive all day and still be on my own spread.
Yep, I had a truck like that once.
Small-town verdicts are usually brief and pointed.
Most everybody in this town knows what's going on, but they read the newspaper to see who got caught at it.
Is there a criminal lawyer in this town?
We think so. We haven't been able to prove it on him.
It took me 20 years to make a man out of my son, but another woman made a fool out of him in 20 minutes.
The white spires of churches are grace notes in many of Vermont's loveliest landscapes. However, church-going doesn't change the Vermont character all that much.
I'm a visitor from Connecticut, Reverend. That was a nice service, but the hymn singing didn't seem very enthusiastic.
I know. My congregation reads every line to see if they'll agree with it before they'll sing it.
At the end of one very moving sermon, everyone in the congregation was in tears, except for one man. As the church emptied, someone asked him how he could have been so unaffected by the sermon.
I belong to another parish.
The warden of one church told his gravedigger that he'd have to dig the graves longer and deeper.
Well, you ain't heard of nobody getting out of them, have you?
What's the death rate around here?
About 1 to a person.
What do you think they'll do when old man Appleby dies?
Likely they'll bury him.
How much money did Grover Ainsworth leave when he died?
All of it.
Olin Matthews was 98 when he died, and the whole town walked all the way out to the graveyard for the burial service. On the way back, Aunt Nettie Sheldrake had a short conversation with her neighbor's 8-year-old boy.
How old are you, Granny?
79.
Hardly pays you to go back to town.
One of the town road crew called the chairman of the Board of Selectmen at 4 o'clock one winter morning to tell him that the highway foreman had just dropped dead and asked,
"Can I take its place?"
It's all right with me, if it's all right with the undertaker.
Most of these stories and sayings I heard in Vermont, but that's not saying I might not have heard them somewhere else. There is a universality in folklore, and I've heard visitors say, "Something in me belongs in Vermont." So maybe many of the stories speak to tough-minded, high-hearted people everywhere. There is one story or parable that certainly does.
A young man walked up to the crest of a hill overlooking a small Vermont village. At the top, he met an old man resting beside a mountain spring. The young man looked down at the village and said,
"What kind of folks live in the village down there?"
What kind of folks lived in the village you came from?
They were the meanest bunch of bad-mouthed gossips I ever knew.
That's just what they're like down there.
The young man turned and started back to where he had come from. While the old man still sat by the spring, another young man toiled up the hill. He too stopped at the spring and looked down at the village.
What are the folks like who live down there?
What were they like in the town you came from?
The young man said they were the finest, friendliest, most generous neighbors a man could want.
That's just what they're like down there.
The young man thanked him and started down the hill. Our native state, whether we were born there or not.